The paper looks at how, in the year 1917, Monsieur Dalgado, an internationally renowned linguist, forever changed the course of the Konkani Marathi controversy. In a 9-part series titled Konkani is not a dialect of Marathi, published in the Panjim Daily Heraldo, he analyzed the linguistic and grammatical characteristics of Konkani, demonstrating its identity as distinct from that of Marathi. But then, what events led Monsieur Dalgado to write the series? The Konkani Marathi controversy was not as ancient as it might seem. It was just a 19th century fabrication. Konkani, which like Marathi evolved from Prakrit, began to make rapid strides on the linguistic, lexicographic, and literary front thanks to the ingenuity of the European missionaries in 16th century Goa. It is another matter that their interest began to wane and indifference turned into state hostility to some extent, at least on paper. This brought the first modern literary period of Konkani literature to an inglorious end. In the 18th century, literary production in Goa was conspicuous by its absence due to the shutdown of the press, of the printing press. Not only did Konkani get relegated to the background, Goa itself became a backwater. Even so, there was not a doubt about Konkani's linguistic status until the year 1807, when John Leyden dubbed it a dialect of Marathi. His ideas began to gain currency in British India. When those echoes reached Portuguese India, Konkani was excluded from the curriculum of the first state-owned school set up in 1931. By now, in the new liberal regime, it suited Goan Catholics to adopt Portuguese as their cultural language, while the Hindus continued to seek refuge in Marathi and turned to Portuguese only in the next century, in the following century. Meanwhile, in 1858, Cunha Rivara's famous essay on the Konkani language decried Goa's contempt of its native language and defended its dignity. His realization was perhaps a byproduct of a new Orientalist consciousness in India, which prized the rediscovery of indigenous languages. Except that it is Marathi and not Konkani that drew the benefit. In 1869, at the behest of Goa's first official, Goa's official translator, Suryaji Anand Rao, the state government banned the use of Konkani, while Marathi ruled the roost at the Panjim Lyceum. A decade later, when R.G. Bhandarkar in Bombay reiterated Konkani's dialect status, scholars favoring the dialect theory slightly outnumbered those favoring the language theory. But a fitting reply awaited Bhandarkar in 1881 when José Jason de Cunha systematized and coordinated the arguments of the language theory in his famous book, Konkani Language and Literature. Nonetheless, in 1905, Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India, LSI, which we saw in the morning, published by the British government, buttressed the dialect myth. The case of Konkani was quietly and insidiously growing into a big problem. By the beginning of the 20th century, linguistic theories backed by the British colonial administration in India seemed at odds with those articulated in Portuguese India. And curiously, on either side of the Western Ghats, the foreign element seemed more vocal than the native educated class, which patronized but did not write in the vernacular. That was a time when the masses created the theatre and the Konkani language press in Bombay. In Pune, Goan writer Eduard Brun Souza modified the Roman script for use in Konkani, calling it the Marian alphabet. Goans in Bombay, largely the Hindu Brahmins, published in Marathi but failed to construct an identity as their Catholic counterparts were doing through Konkani literature. While the Konkani movement was thus gaining momentum within the community in Bombay, back in Goa, Garces Palha and Fernando Leal, two mestiços, mixed blood Portuguese Goan, who had probably caught the Orientalist bug, began a crusade for the resurrection of Konkani. They were supported mostly by members of the Goan Catholic elite. In 1916, when Dada Vaidya spoke in Konkani at Goa's first provincial congress, Marathi writer Shamba Suryarao Sardesai shouted him down, and followed it up with a two-part article disparaging the Konkani movement. The division of Goan society was complete, not only between educated Christians and Hindus, but also within the Hindu community. By February 1917, therefore, the stage was set for Dalgado's intervention from distant Lisbon. The tireless Goan Catholic missionary was now on a mission to prove Konkani's credentials as a language. He had published a Konkani Portuguese dictionary in Bombay and a Portuguese Konkani dictionary in Lisbon. The university professor and fellow of the Portuguese Academy of Sciences was an authority on the influence of Portuguese on Asian languages, but his thoughts kept returning to Konkani. Significantly, his last unpublished work was a Konkani grammar, which Father Mohsin Ataid translated into English in Dalgado's centenary year 2022. Dalgado's authoritative voice in Heraldo infused the Konkani camp with a new confidence, helping to put many issues to rest. But alas, his articles remain unread by the non-Portuguese speaking majority who could have profited by it. Hoping to right that historical wrong and pay homage to that rare scholar, I had the opportunity of translating his text into English in the death centenary year. The series was later published in the Lisbon-based online magazine Revista da Casa de Goa. Dalgado's entry was decisive. I think it was a watershed moment in the history of Konkani language and Konkani studies. Portuguese language newspapers in Goa, as well as bilingual newspapers in Bombay, began to comment on Dalgado's efforts in the field. After him, Jules Bloch showed how distinct Marathi was from Konkani. S.M. Khatri parallel blocks and book into his own book called Formation of Konkani, and V.P. Chavan, and both of them helped further Konkani's position as a separate language. Varde Valaulikar's writings continued Dalgado's work of demonstrating Konkani's individuality. Curiously, Varde Valaulikar, was by now called Shanoy Goibab, began by writing in Marathi, and after switching to Konkani, wrote first in the Roman script. So he's got 7 or 9 books out of his 29, which are in the Roman script. Okay. There was no Konkani worth the name in the Devanagari script in Bombay, and much less in Goa. Perhaps Dalgado and Valaulikar never met or exchanged correspondence, but they shared the same vision. Valaulikar, who knew Portuguese, must have read Dalgado's rejoinder to Shamba Sardesai. While Valaulikar carried out a literary crusade in Bombay, Dalgado's academic legacy was kept alive by his pupil Marian Saldanha in Lisbon. Dalgado died in 1922 and Shanoy Goibab died in 1946. 6 years later, 1952, Marian Saldanha was in Bombay as the president of the 5th All India Konkani Parishad held there. As a votary of the Roman script, Saldanha's address was printed in the Roman script alongside the Devanagari script, the Devanagari text. By the 1950s, the demand for linguistic states had gained significant momentum, leading to the creation of the Telugu-speaking Andhra out of the state of Madras. Much earlier, the Indian National Congress had organized its provisional committees along linguistic zones, signaling an earlier form of the concept. Dalgado and Valaulikar's vision of Konkani in the Devanagari script dovetailed into that concept, whereas Saldanha envisioned the Roman script for Konkani in Goa. It did not materialize in the post-1961 scenario for obvious reasons. It was an entirely new ball game after Goa got into the Indian Union. Maharashtra had laid claim to Goa, deeming Konkani a dialect of Marathi. Once again, the Goan elite, which was once divided between Portuguese and Marathi, leaving Konkani to fend for herself, now realized that only Konkani could help preserve their identity. 3 minutes, no? It was a David and Goliath situation in which Konkani won because the language was on the people's lips and nobody could take it away. Its literature was perhaps not on a par with the best in the country, but it had a strong foundation built by Dalgado and Valaulikar. Hence, while Valaulikar is regarded as the father of modern Konkani literature, Dalgado, by his fundamental contribution to the development of the language, ought to be regarded as the grandfather, pun intended, grandfather of modern Konkani. Their impact was felt at the time of the opinion poll and when Sahitya Academy recognized Konkani as a literary language. Their impact was felt when Goa achieved statehood and Konkani became the state language, and when Konkani was finally included in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Thereafter, Konkani came into a privileged position as never before. It would seem like a time to consolidate had arrived. For instance, in the Konkani world beyond Goa, it would pay dividends to make the most of the multi-script situation. But that was not to be. In Goa, the issue of script remains Konkani's Achilles heel. The sooner this is resolved, the better, to ensure the interests of all the user communities. Their well-being is bound to produce positive results for the popularity and the expansion of the Konkani language. The more the scripts, the better. That's what I mean to say. It is also a time for some reflection. Has the shared legacy created by Dalgado and Shanoy Goimbab been put to creative use? It would be interesting to consider what their response would be to our globalized world. How would they respond to demands for recognition of the Roman script in today's multilingual and multicultural world? Would they consider it an opportunity to woo back Konkani speakers at home and in the diaspora and to win new speakers from across the big wide world? Would they appreciate the possibility of Konkani finally becoming at once a means of communication and identity marker? After all, living languages are dynamic and no script is perfect. Goenkanadi was the earliest known native script that Konkani used before it was supplanted by others. Similarly, the earliest known script for the English language was the Anglo-Saxon Pewter. From the 7th century onwards, the Latin alphabet began to replace that script, though they coexisted for some time in England. In India, the same thing. The Latin or Roman script is not to be considered foreign. It is as Indian as the English language in the country. If the English language can be made official, so can the Roman script and any other for that matter, if numbers and the volume of work justifies it. Not to let script remain a divisive issue, would Dalgado and Shanoy Goimbab then consider letting Goa be the first state within the Indian Union to successfully resolve a multi-script situation? Any script that has worked in the past ought to work in the future. This applies to the Roman script as well. Surely, Dalgado's mission was to save the language over and above the script. Thank you.